Look at her, folks. She can't even serve a plate right. Preston Caldwell's mocking voice rang out as he poured tomato sauce over Loretta Banks's head, the red liquid dripping down her hair and dress, sparking laughter from the wedding guests. At 60, Loretta stood frozen, her dignity shattered in front of Atlanta's elite, her heart heavy with a secret that could unravel everything. This isn't just a story of cruelty. It's a journey of buried truths and unexpected redemption that will leave you stunned. Stick with me to uncover how one woman's quiet strength turned a moment of humiliation into a life-changing revelation. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and share in the comments where you're listening from, city, country, or even the time of day. Trust me, this tale's twist will keep you hooked until the very end. The kitchen was a sanctuary of gleaming marble and soft light, its stainless steel appliances humming quietly in the Atlanta night. Loretta Banks stood alone under the glow of pendant lamps, her hands moving with practiced grace as she polished a crystal wine glass to a flawless shine. At 60, her fingers were calloused, her back ached from years of labor, but her eyes held a quiet fire, a resilience forged through decades of love and loss. The mansion around her, sprawling and opulent, belonged to Preston Caldwell, a wealthy white real estate tycoon, and his fiancée, Zora Hamilton, a rising black fashion designer. To the world, Loretta was just the help, a shadow moving through their glittering lives. But beneath her worn apron beat a heart heavy with a secret, a truth she carried like a fragile treasure, one she wasn't sure she'd ever have the courage to unveil. She set the glass down, its delicate clink against the counter echoing in the stillness. Her gaze drifted to the window, where the city skyline shimmered in the distance. Atlanta had changed since her youth, but its pulse still felt familiar, a rhythm that stirred memories of a different time. Loretta's mind wandered back to a cramped apartment in a forgotten corner of the city, where she'd raised Zora Hamilton from the age of 3. Back then, Zora was a tiny spark of a girl, all wide eyes and endless questions, clinging to Loretta's skirts while her parents worked late shifts to keep the lights on. Loretta had been more than a nanny. She'd been a second mother, teaching Zora to sketch flowers with crayons, baking molasses cookies that filled the apartment with warmth, and singing soft lullabies to chase away the girl's fears. Those were the days when love was enough to fill the gaps left by poverty, when Zora's laughter was Loretta's greatest reward. Now, standing in this mansion that could swallow that old apartment whole, Loretta felt a pang of sorrow. Zora, the child she'd cradled through sleepless nights, had become a stranger. The young woman who swept through these halls in silk dresses and confident strides seemed to have erased her past, as if the years with Loretta were a chapter best forgotten. Loretta didn't blame her, not entirely. Zora had clawed her way into a world of glamour and privilege, a world where admitting you once lived in a one-bedroom apartment with peeling paint could tarnish your shine. But the silence hurt, a quiet wound that throbbed every time Zora passed her without a glance, her eyes fixed on Preston or her next design. Preston Caldwell was another matter. To Zora, he was the picture of charm, doting, generous, with a smile that could light up a room. But Loretta saw a different man. His politeness was a thin veneer, cracking whenever he addressed her. "Mrs. Banks," he'd say, his voice clipped, "make sure those glasses are spotless. We can't have smudges for the engagement party." His tone carried a subtle disdain, a hint of something Loretta recognized from years of navigating spaces where she was never quite welcome. She'd caught his sidelong glances, the way his lips curled when she lingered too long in a room. To him, she was just the help, an elderly black woman whose presence was tolerated only as long as she remained invisible. Zora, caught up in Preston's affection, seemed blind to it, her faith in his kindness unshaken. Loretta sighed, wiping her hands on her apron. She reached for another glass, her movements mechanical but precise. The mansion was quiet tonight, the calm before the storm of wedding preparations. In a few weeks, 200 guests, mostly Preston's wealthy white friends and business associates, would fill these rooms, their laughter echoing off the chandeliers. Loretta's job was to ensure everything was perfect, from the hand-stitched tablecloths to the roses arranged in precise gradients of white. Preston's demands were relentless, each task laced with an unspoken expectation that she'd fail. Yet she hadn't, not yet. She'd learned long ago to swallow her pride, to keep her head down and her heart guarded. But tonight, alone in the kitchen, her guard slipped. She pulled a small, worn photo from her apron pocket, its edges frayed from years of handling. It showed a 5-year-old Zora, beaming in a sundress Loretta had sewn by hand. The fabric, a bright patchwork of saved scraps. Zora's tiny hand clutched Loretta's, her smile a mirror of the love they'd shared. Tucked behind the photo was a note, scrawled in a child's uneven handwriting. Auntie Loretta, I love you like my mother. Loretta's throat tightened. She had kept these treasures hidden, not just from Preston, but from Zora too. Afraid to stir a past Zora seemed determined to bury. The kitchen door swung open, startling her. Zora stood there, radiant in a tailored blazer, her hair swept into an elegant bun. Loretta, can you make sure the dining room is ready for tomorrow's fitting? Preston's bringing the caterers. Her voice was warm but distracted, her eyes avoiding Loretta's. Loretta nodded, slipping the photo back into her pocket. Yes, Miss Zora, I'll take care of it. Zora hesitated as if sensing the weight in Loretta's tone, but then offered a quick smile and left. The door closed and Loretta was alone again, the ache in her chest deepening. She turned back to the glasses, her reflection wavering in their polished surfaces. She was 60 years old, her life a tapestry of sacrifice and quiet strength. She'd raised a child who now stood on the cusp of a new life, unaware of the woman who'd shaped her. And Preston, his coldness was a reminder of the world's sharp edges, edges Loretta had shielded Zora from long ago. As she worked, a resolve began to form, faint but unyielding. She couldn't stay silent forever. The truth, like the light in this kitchen, would find its way out. And when it did, it would change everything. The chandelier in the dining room cast a golden glow over the long mahogany table, its surface gleaming under Loretta Banks's meticulous care. She moved with the quiet precision of someone who'd spent decades making other people's homes flawless, arranging silver cutlery with the exactness of a surgeon. The air buzzed with anticipation. Tonight was the tasting dinner for Preston Caldwell and Zora Hamilton's wedding, a prelude to the grand affair that would draw Atlanta's elite. Loretta, at 60, felt the weight of her role more keenly than ever. Her hands, steady despite their calluses, aligned each crystal goblet, but her heart churned with unease. Preston's cold glances and clipped commands had grown sharper in recent weeks, and tonight, with guests arriving, she sensed a storm brewing. The doorbell chimed, and the first of the evening's guests swept in. Preston's business associates, their tailored suits and polished smiles reeking of privilege. Loretta greeted them with a nod, her navy dress pressed but plain, her presence meant to fade into the background. Zora followed, radiant in a flowing emerald gown, her laughter bright as she clung to Preston's arm. To the world, they were the perfect couple, a vision of love and ambition. But Loretta saw what Zora missed, the way Preston's eyes narrowed when he looked her way, the subtle curl of his lip that spoke of disdain. Zora, caught in the glow of his affection, seemed oblivious, her faith in his kindness unshaken. As the guests settled around the table, Loretta moved silently, serving plates of seared scallops and roasted fig salad. The caterer, a wiry man named Marcel, whispered instructions to her, his voice tense with the pressure of pleasing Preston. Make sure every plate is perfect, Loretta. Mr. Caldwell's got a sharp eye. She nodded, her focus unwavering, though her thoughts drifted to the little girl she'd once taught to draw flowers. The Zora who'd called her Co with a giggle. That Zora felt like a ghost now, replaced by a woman who barely met her eyes. The trouble began with a single spoon. Loretta had placed it precisely, but as she stepped back to survey the table, Preston's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. Mrs. Banks, he said, loud enough for every head to turn, this spoon is off by an inch. Can't you do one simple thing right? The room fell silent, the guest's eyes darting to Loretta. Her cheeks burned, but she kept her voice steady. I'm sorry, Mr. Caldwell. I'll fix it. She reached for the spoon, her hands trembling slightly, but Preston wasn't done. Maybe you should find a job that suits your skills better, he added, his tone dripping with condescension. A few guests chuckled, their laughter a sharp jab to Loretta's pride. Zora's eyes flicked to Loretta, a flicker of discomfort crossing her face, but she said nothing. Instead, she touched Preston's arm, her smile tight. Everything looks wonderful, darling, she murmured, redirecting the conversation to the food. Loretta retreated to the kitchen, her heart pounding, the sting of humiliation settling deep. She'd faced worse in her life, years of scraping by, of being invisible in rooms like this, but this cut differently. Zora's silence, her failure to defend the woman who'd raised her, was a betrayal that hurt more than Preston's words. In the kitchen, Loretta leaned against the counter, her breath uneven. Marcel glanced at her, his expression sympathetic. "Don't let him get to you," he whispered. "He's just showing off for his friends." But Loretta knew it was more than that. Preston's cruelty wasn't just arrogance. It carried the weight of something uglier, a disdain she'd felt before in spaces where her skin marked her as less. She straightened, forcing herself to focus, and returned to the dining room with a tray of desserts. The evening wore on, and Preston's barbs continued. When Loretta cleared a plate, he muttered, loud enough for the nearest guest to hear, "Careful, Mrs. Banks, don't drop anything. We wouldn't want a mess." Another ripple of laughter followed, and Loretta's jaw tightened. She caught Zora's gaze again, hoping for a spark of recognition, a hint of the bond they'd once shared. But Zora only offered a quick, apologetic smile before turning back to her guests, her laughter a little too bright, as if trying to drown out the tension. Later, as the guests departed and the mansion grew quiet, Zora found Loretta in the kitchen, scrubbing pots with a ferocity born of suppressed anger. "Loretta," Zora said softly, "I'm sorry about tonight. Preston's just stressed with the wedding planning." Loretta paused, her hands still in the soapy water, and looked at Zora. The young woman's eyes were earnest, but they carried a naivety that pierced Loretta's heart. "He didn't mean it," Zora continued, her voice almost pleading. "He's not like that, not really." Loretta wanted to believe her, wanted to see the man Zora loved, a man who'd swept her off her feet with charm and promises. But she'd seen too much in her 60 years to trust words over actions. "I understand, Miss Zora," she said, her voice calm but distant. "I'll make sure everything's perfect for the wedding." Zora hesitated, as if sensing the wall between them, then nodded and left. Alone again, Loretta dried her hands, her fingers brushing the photo in her apron pocket. The weight of Zora's note, "Co Loretta, conyo con humecon," felt heavier than ever. She stood under the kitchen lights, the mansion silent around her. Preston's words echoed in her mind, each one a reminder of her place in his world. But Loretta was no stranger to hardship. She'd raised a child through poverty, weathered loss, and built a life on quiet strength. Tonight's humiliation was just the beginning, she knew. The wedding loomed, and with it, more chances for Preston to wield his cruelty. But something stirred in Loretta, a resolve, faint but growing, to hold on to the truth she carried. Zora might have forgotten, but Loretta hadn't, and soon she vowed the past would come to light. The Atlanta summer sun poured through the tall windows of the Caldwell mansion, bathing the marble floors in a harsh, unrelenting light. Loretta Banks moved through the grand halls, her steps measured but heavy, a damp cloth in one hand and a bottle of imported polish in the other. At 60, her body protested the endless tasks, scrubbing banisters, arranging vases, ensuring every surface gleamed for the upcoming wedding. But it wasn't the physical strain that weighed on her. It was the invisible pressure, the suffocating weight of Preston Caldwell's growing contempt, that pressed against her chest like a stone. Each day brought a new demand, a new slight, and Loretta felt the threads of her patience fraying, her heart bruised by the silence of Zora Hamilton, the girl she'd raised like her own. Preston's cruelty sharpened in the weeks leading to the wedding, especially when Zora was absent. He'd stride into rooms where Loretta worked alone, his eyes scanning for flaws with predatory precision. "Mrs. Banks," he'd say, his voice laced with mockery, "these roses are off-center. Did you not understand my instructions, or is this just incompetence?" The words stung, but Loretta would nod, her face a mask of calm, and adjust the flowers, her hands steady despite the tremor in her soul. She learned long ago to swallow her pride, to let insults slide like water off stone. But each barb from Preston chipped away at her resolve. His disdain wasn't just personal, it carried the familiar bite of prejudice, a reminder that to him she was less than human, a black woman whose labor was expected, but whose presence was barely tolerated. Zora's absence during these moments made the pain sharper. When Preston wasn't around, Zora would slip into the kitchen, her smile warm but fleeting, offering half-hearted apologies. "He's under so much pressure, Loretta," she'd say, her voice soft, almost pleading. "The wedding's got him on edge. He doesn't mean it." Loretta wanted to shake her, to make her see the man behind the charm, but Zora's eyes were clouded with love, blind to the cruelty Loretta endured. The young woman Loretta had once rocked to sleep now stood on the other side of an invisible wall, her loyalty torn between the man she loved and the woman who'd raised her. Each time Zora excused Preston's behavior, Loretta felt a piece of their bond unravel, a wound that bled quietly beneath her apron. One afternoon, as Loretta polished the dining room chandelier, Preston entered with a group of his colleagues, their voices loud with the confidence of wealth. He barely glanced at her before pointing to a smudge on a mirror she'd cleaned twice that morning. "Mrs. Banks, this is unacceptable," he said, his tone sharp enough to draw the group's attention. "If you can't keep up with basic standards, perhaps you're not cut out for this household." The men chuckled, their eyes sliding over Loretta as if she were part of the decor, something to be critiqued and dismissed. She murmured an apology, her cheeks burning, and set to work on the mirror, her cloth moving in tight, furious circles. Preston lingered, watching her with a smirk, as if her humiliation was a sport he relished. That evening, alone in the servants' quarters above the garage, Loretta sat on her narrow bed, her hands clasped tightly. The room was sparse, a single bed, a small table, a lamp casting a dim glow, but it was hers, a refuge from the mansion's cold grandeur. She pulled the worn photo from her apron, the one of 5-year-old Zora in the sundress she'd sewn. The memory of that day flooded back. Zora's laughter as she twirled, the fabric catching the sunlight, her tiny voice declaring, "Co-Loretta makes the best dresses." Now Zora wore gowns that cost more than Loretta's yearly wages, and the woman who'd crafted her first dress was just the help. Loretta traced the photo with her finger, her heart aching. She didn't resent Zora's success. She was proud of it. But the distance between them felt like a betrayal. The next day, Preston's demands escalated. He insisted the guest bathrooms be cleaned daily, even those unused, with a specific cleaner imported from France. "I entertain important people, Mrs. Banks," he said, standing too close, his voice low and cutting. "If you can't meet my standards, you're replaceable." Loretta nodded, her jaw tight, but inside she burned. Replaceable. The word echoed the years she'd spent proving her worth in a world that often saw her as less. She thought of Zora, who was out meeting with her wedding planner, unaware of the venom Preston directed at the woman who'd raised her. Loretta wanted to believe Zora would see through him, but doubt gnawed at her. Was the girl she'd loved so fiercely gone for good? As the wedding drew closer, the mansion became a whirlwind of activity. Florists, caterers, planners buzzing through the halls. Loretta worked from dawn to dusk, her hands raw from cleaning, her back aching from carrying trays. Yet Preston's scrutiny never eased. During a final walkthrough with the event coordinator, he pointed to a tablecloth Loretta had ironed that morning. "This is wrinkled," he snapped, though the fabric was flawless. "Do it again, and don't waste my time." The coordinator, a young woman with a clipboard, shifted uncomfortably but said nothing. Loretta redid the task, her movements mechanical, her mind racing. She couldn't keep living like this, invisible and degraded. But the thought of leaving Zora in Preston's hands felt like abandoning a child all over again. That night, as she scrubbed the kitchen counters, Loretta's thoughts turned to the wedding. She imagined the 200 guests, their wealth and privilege filling the mansion with noise and judgment. She pictured Zora, radiant in her gown, and Preston, charming the crowd while casting her aside with a glance. The injustice of it all simmered in her chest, a fire she could no longer smother. She slipped her hand into her apron, feeling the edges of Zora's note. "Co Loretta, conyo konumikon." It was a reminder of who she'd been to Zora and who she still was, even if Zora had forgotten. Loretta's resolve hardened. She wouldn't let Preston's cruelty erase her. The wedding was coming, and with it, a reckoning she could feel in her bones. The Caldwell mansion hummed with frenetic energy, its halls a flurry of florists arranging white carnations and planners barking orders through headsets. Loretta Banks moved through the chaos like a ghost, her hands steady as she polished silver candelabras, her heart a tangle of resolve and dread. The wedding was days away, and the weight of Preston Caldwell's relentless demands pressed harder on her 60-year-old frame. Each task, ironing linens, scrubbing tiles, arranging centerpieces, was a test, and Preston's sharp eyes missed nothing. His cruelty had become a constant, a blade honed by the approaching nuptials, and Loretta felt it slice deeper with every passing hour. But in the quiet corners of her mind, a spark of defiance flickered, fueled by a secret she could no longer keep buried. Preston's latest barb came during a rehearsal dinner setup. Loretta was aligning place cards when he swept in, his tailored suit pristine, his voice cutting through the chatter of vendors. "Mrs. Banks," he said, loud enough to draw the attention of a nearby florist, "these napkins are folded sloppily. Do you think my guests deserve this kind of carelessness?" The napkins were flawless, each edge crisp, but Loretta knew better than to argue. "I'll refold them, Mr. Caldwell," she replied, her voice steady despite the heat rising in her cheeks. He smirked, a glint of satisfaction in his eyes, and turned to charm a group of arriving guests. The florist shot Loretta a sympathetic glance, but it did little to dull the sting. She refolded the napkins, her fingers trembling with suppressed anger, her thoughts drifting to Zora Hamilton, the woman who'd once called her family, but now stood silent as Preston's venom flowed. Zora was elsewhere, caught up in fittings and menu tastings, her laughter echoing from distant rooms. Loretta caught glimpses of her, a vision in silk, radiant with the glow of a bride-to-be, but their interactions were fleeting. Zora would offer a quick smile or a murmured, "Thank you," but her eyes never lingered, as if afraid to confront the past they shared. Loretta understood the weight of Zora's new world, the pressure to belong among Atlanta's elite, but each avoidance felt like a fresh wound. She'd raised Zora through sleepless nights and tearful days, stitching dresses from scraps and teaching her to dream beyond their cramped apartment. Now Zora seemed determined to erase that history, and Loretta's heart ached with the loss of the girl who'd once clung to her like a lifeline. That evening, exhausted from a day of endless tasks, Loretta retreated to the servants' quarters above the garage. The small room was her sanctuary, its plain walls a stark contrast to the mansion's opulence. She sat on the edge of her bed, her hands resting on a wooden keepsake box she'd brought from her old life. It was worn, its varnish faded, but it held her most precious treasures. She opened it with care, her breath catching as she lifted out a photograph of 5-year-old Zora, her smile bright in the sundress Loretta had sewn. Tucked beneath it was a note in childish scrawl. "Co Loretta, Conyo ko numecon." The words blurred as tears welled in Loretta's eyes. She'd carried these relics for decades, a tether to the love she'd poured into Zora, but they also reminded her of the distance that had grown between them. The box held more than memories. It held her resolve. As she traced the photo's edges, Loretta felt a shift inside her. She'd endured Preston's insults, his thinly veiled prejudice, for too long. She'd stayed silent to protect Zora's happiness, fearing that revealing their bond would disrupt the life Zora had built. But the cruelty she faced, the way Preston diminished her in front of others, was a fire that burned away her hesitation. She couldn't let this man, who Zora believed to be kind, continue to wield his power unchecked. The wedding would be her chance, not to destroy, but to reclaim the truth of who she was to Zora and who Zora was to her. The next day, Preston's demands grew even more absurd. He insisted the ballroom's chandelier be cleaned with a specific solution, applied in circular motions, then buffed to a mirror shine. "My guests expect perfection, Mrs. Banks," he said, standing over her as she worked, his voice dripping with condescension. "If you can't deliver, I'll find someone who can." Loretta nodded, her face impassive, but inside her resolve hardened. She thought of the keepsake box, of the photo and note that proved her place in Zora's life. She imagined showing them to Zora, watching recognition dawn in her eyes, but the thought was tinged with fear. What if Zora rejected her again, choosing Preston's world over their shared past? Later, during a quiet moment in the storage room, Loretta opened the keepsake box again. She held the note to the light, its faded ink a testament to a love that had once been unbreakable. She remembered Zora's laughter as they baked cookies, the way the girl's tiny hand fit in hers during walks to the park. Those memories were her strength, her proof that she was more than the help Preston saw. She closed the box, her decision made. The wedding was looming, and with it, a moment that could change everything. She wouldn't let Preston's cruelty define her. She would speak, not for revenge, but for the truth that had been buried too long. The keepsake box was her anchor, and its secrets were about to light the way. The Caldwell mansion glittered like a jewel under the Atlanta sky, its ballroom transformed into a vision of white carnations and cascading chandeliers. The air thrummed with the laughter of 200 guests, their designer clothes and clinking champagne glasses a testament to wealth and status. Loretta Banks moved through the crowd, a shadow in her plain navy dress, her hands steady as she balanced a tray of appetizers. At 60, her body ached from days of relentless preparation, but her spirit burned with a quiet resolve. Tonight was Preston Caldwell and Zora Hamilton's wedding, the culmination of weeks of her labor under Preston's cruel scrutiny. Yet beneath her calm exterior, Loretta felt the weight of the keepsake box's secrets, the photograph and note that could unravel everything. She wasn't sure when or if she'd reveal them, but the fire in her chest told her the moment was near. The ceremony had been flawless. Zora, a radiant bride in a gown that shimmered like moonlight. Preston, the charming groom with a smile that dazzled the crowd. Loretta had watched from the kitchen, her heart torn between pride and pain as Zora walked down the aisle, unaware of the woman who'd raised her standing in the shadows. Now as the reception unfolded, Loretta served the main course, her movements precise despite the weight of Preston's gaze. She could feel his eyes on her, waiting for a misstep, his disdain a constant undercurrent. Zora, seated at the head table, seemed lost in the moment, her laughter bright but distant, her faith in Preston's kindness still unshaken. Then it happened. As Loretta leaned to serve a plate of roasted beef to a guest, Preston stood, his voice cutting through the din like a whip. "Well, folks, looks like our help needs a lesson in grace," he announced, his tone mocking. Before Loretta could react, he lifted a dish of tomato sauce and poured it deliberately over her head. The warm, sticky liquid cascaded down her hair, dripping onto her face and soaking her dress. The room erupted in laughter. The guests, mostly Preston's white associates, clapping and cheering as if it were a planned performance. "Do it again, Preston," one called, while another raised a glass, grinning. Loretta froze, her tray clattering to the floor, the sauce stinging her eyes as humiliation seared her soul. She looked to Zora, hoping for a spark of outrage, but the bride sat stunned, her face pale, her eyes wide with shock. Zora's mouth opened, then closed, her hands gripping the edge of the table. Loretta saw the disbelief in her gaze, the shattering of the illusion that Preston was the kind, generous man she'd loved. The guests' laughter grew louder, a cacophony that drowned out Loretta's dignity, each chuckle a blade in her heart. She wanted to run, to disappear into the night, but her feet felt rooted, her pride warring with the shame that threatened to swallow her. At 60, she'd faced prejudice before, but this, public, deliberate, and cheered on, was a new kind of cruelty. Loretta's hand slipped into her apron pocket, brushing against the photograph and note she'd carried all day. The memory of Zora's childish scrawl, "Ko Loretta, konyo kon humikon," ignited something within her. She couldn't stay silent any longer. The pain of Preston's act, the betrayal of Zora's silence, and the weight of their shared past pushed her past the breaking point. She straightened, wiping the sauce from her eyes, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm sorry, Miss Zora," she whispered to herself, knowing the words would soon be spoken aloud. She turned and walked toward the storage room, her steps slow but deliberate, the guests' laughter fading behind her. In the dim, cluttered room, Loretta opened her keepsake box, her hands shaking as she lifted the photograph of 5-year-old Zora in the sundress she'd sewn. The note, fragile with age, seemed to pulse with the truth she'd buried for too long. She saw Zora's face in her mind, not the bride in silk, but the little girl who'd clung to her through storms and loneliness. Preston's cruelty had stripped away her hesitation. She would tell Zora the truth, not to destroy her happiness, but to reclaim the bond they'd shared. The wedding was still in full swing, the music and chatter filtering through the walls, but Loretta knew she couldn't return to the ballroom as just the help. She clutched the photo and note, her resolve hardening like steel. The moment of reckoning was coming, and it would change everything. The ballroom pulsed with the rhythm of celebration, the clink of champagne flutes, and the hum of laughter filling the air. But for Loretta Banks, the world had narrowed to the weight of the keepsake box's contents in her trembling hands. The tomato sauce still clung to her hair, its sticky residue a humiliating reminder of Preston Caldwell's cruelty, but it was the fire in her chest that propelled her forward. At 60, Loretta had endured decades of quiet indignities, but the public spectacle at the wedding had shattered her silence. Clutching the photograph of a 5-year-old Zora Hamilton and the note that read, "Co Loretta, con yo con humicon," she moved through the mansion's back halls, her resolve a blazing beacon. Tonight, the truth would no longer be a secret buried in her apron pocket. She found Zora in a private dressing room, the bride's radiant gown catching the soft glow of a vanity mirror. Zora sat alone, her hands twisting in her lap, her face etched with unease. The shock of Preston's act, pouring sauce over Loretta's head to the delight of his guests, had left her rattled, her belief in his kindness crumbling. Loretta closed the door, the click echoing like a gavel. "Miss Zora," she said, her voice steady despite the storm within. "We need to talk." Zora's eyes widened, a mix of guilt and fear flickering across her face. Loretta placed the photograph and note on the vanity, their worn edges stark against the polished wood. "Do you remember these?" she asked, her tone gentle but unyielding. Zora's breath caught as she lifted the photo, her fingers tracing the image of her younger self in the sundress Loretta had sewn. Memories flooded back, afternoons sketching flowers, nights curled up under Loretta's lullabies. The warmth of a love that had anchored her through a childhood of scarcity. She unfolded the note, her eyes brimming with tears as she read her own childish words. "Co Loretta," she whispered, her voice breaking. I tried to forget that life. I thought I had to fit into Preston's world." She looked up, her face a map of regret. "I was wrong. I'm so sorry for letting him treat you like that." Loretta's heart softened, but she knew the moment demanded more than apologies. She took a deep breath, her decision made in the storage room's quiet. She left Zora and walked to the ballroom, where the band played a lively tune and guests swirled on the dance floor. With a courage born of years of silent strength, she approached the bandleader and took the microphone, her hands steady despite the sauce still staining her dress. The music stopped, and 200 pairs of eyes turned to her, a mix of curiosity and confusion rippling through the crowd. Preston, standing near the head table, froze, his face darkening. "I'm not just the help," Loretta said, her voice clear and resonant, cutting through the murmurs. "I raised Zora Hamilton from when she was 3 years old. I taught her to draw, sewed her first dress, held her when her world felt too heavy." She held up the photograph and note, their simplicity a stark contrast to the room's opulence. "I loved her like my own, and she loved me back." The crowd fell silent, the weight of her words settling over them. Zora emerged from the back, her gown trailing, her face streaked with tears. She stepped beside Loretta, taking her hand. "It's true," Zora said, her voice trembling but firm. "Loretta is my family, my second mother. I was wrong to let her be treated this way." Preston's face twisted with fury. "This is absurd," he shouted, striding forward. "You're ruining our wedding with this nonsense." But Zora turned to him, her shock giving way to clarity. "No, Preston, you ruined it," she said, her voice steady now. "I thought you were kind, but what you did to Loretta, pouring sauce on her, humiliating her, was cruel. I can't marry someone who treats people like that." Gasps rippled through the guests, some nodding in quiet approval, others whispering about Preston's disgrace. Zora faced the crowd, her resolve unshaken. "This wedding is over," she declared. "I won't build a life with someone who disrespects the woman who raised me." The ballroom seemed to hold its breath, the weight of Zora's words sinking in. Preston's charm crumbled, his face a mask of disbelief and anger. He tried to speak, to salvage his image, but the guest murmurs drowned him out. Some moved by Loretta's story, others stunned by Zora's courage. Loretta stood tall, the photograph and note still in her hand, her heart pounding with a mix of relief and sorrow. She hadn't wanted to break Zora's world, but the truth had demanded its moment. As Zora squeezed her hand, Loretta felt the bond they'd shared as child and caregiver flicker back to life, stronger now for having been tested. The wedding was over, but something deeper had begun. The Atlanta skyline glowed against the dusk, its lights a backdrop to the vibrant hum of a charity fashion show unfolding in a downtown venue. Loretta Banks stood backstage, her 60-year-old frame elegant in a tailored navy dress, her hands steady as she adjusted a seam on a model's gown. The air buzzed with anticipation, the crowd a mix of local luminaries and everyday folk gathered to support children in need. Zora Hamilton, radiant in a self-designed silk jumpsuit, moved through the chaos with confidence, her eyes catching Loretta's with a warmth that spoke of a rekindled bond. Months had passed since the wedding that never was, since the moment Loretta's truth had shattered Preston Caldwell's facade and Zora's illusions. Now in this moment of purpose and healing, Loretta felt a peace she hadn't known in decades, a sense that her life's losses had woven into something beautiful. The unraveling of the wedding had been a storm. Zora's declaration, ending her engagement before 200 stunned guests, had left Preston reeling, his charm no match for the weight of his cruelty. Loretta remembered the silence that followed, the way Zora's hand had clung to hers as they left the mansion together, the guests' whispers trailing behind like a fading echo. Preston's attempts at apologies came too late, his words hollow against the image of tomato sauce dripping down Loretta's hair, his laughter ringing in her ears. Zora, her faith in him shattered, had walked away, choosing the woman who'd raised her over a man who'd revealed his heart's darkness. The decision had been a wound, but also a liberation, freeing Zora to reclaim the truth of her past and the love she'd nearly forgotten. In the weeks that followed, Loretta and Zora rebuilt their bond, stitching together the years they'd lost. They spent evenings in Zora's small apartment, far from the mansion's cold grandeur, poring over old photos and sharing stories. Zora laughed through tears as she recalled Loretta's molasses cookies, the way they danced to radio tunes in their cramped kitchen. "I was ashamed of that life," Zora admitted one night, her voice soft with regret. "I thought I had to be someone else to belong in Preston's world." Loretta took her hand, her eyes gentle but firm. "You were always enough, Zora. You still are." Those moments, raw and honest, were a balm to Loretta's heart, proof that the love she'd poured into Zora as a child hadn't faded, only waited for the right moment to bloom again. Zora invited Loretta to join her fashion brand, not as a housekeeper, but as a creative consultant, her skill with a needle and her eye for beauty now shaping collections that celebrated resilience and heritage. Zora's latest line, inspired by their shared past, featured bold patterns and hand-stitched details, each piece a tribute to the woman who'd taught her to dream. Loretta found purpose in the work, her hands crafting garments that told stories of strength, her heart full with the knowledge that she was no longer invisible. Zora, emboldened by her choice to leave Preston, shared their story in a magazine interview, casting Loretta as a symbol of quiet courage, a woman whose love had overcome cruelty and prejudice. Preston, meanwhile, faced the consequences of his actions. The wedding's collapse had rippled through his social circle, his reputation tarnished by whispers of his behavior. Friends and associates distanced themselves, their once warm smiles replaced by cool nods. In a bid to salvage his image, Preston enrolled in a program on racial equity, his publicist touting his commitment to change. He began funding a local organization supporting immigrant workers, a gesture Loretta saw as less about redemption and more about survival. She didn't care. Preston was a chapter closed, his presence no longer a shadow over her life. She'd forgiven him, not for his sake, but for her own, refusing to carry the weight of his cruelty any longer. Tonight's fashion show was the culmination of their journey. The venue pulsed with energy, the runway lined with designs that bore Loretta's touch, intricate embroidery, vibrant hues, a nod to the sundress she'd sewn for Zora decades ago. As the models strode out, the crowd erupted in applause, their cheers a testament to Zora's talent and Loretta's influence. Zora took the stage at the end, her voice clear as she dedicated the show to Loretta. "This is for the woman who raised me," she said, her eyes finding Loretta backstage. "She taught me that love is stronger than shame, that kindness is the truest wealth." The audience rose, their ovation a wave that washed over Loretta, filling the cracks left by years of struggle. As the event wound down, Loretta stood with Zora, watching guests donate generously to the charity for Atlanta's underprivileged children. Zora squeezed her hand, her smile bright with the freedom of her true self. "We're a team now, Loretta," she said, the old endearment a bridge to their past. Loretta's heart swelled, her eyes tracing the faces in the crowd, people moved by their story, by the love that had triumphed over pain. She thought of the little girl who'd once called her mother, now a woman building a legacy of hope. The journey had been long, the losses deep, but here, under the lights of a new beginning, Loretta knew she'd found her place again. Not as the help, but as family, forever. This is the story of Loretta Banks, a woman whose quiet strength and unbreakable love turned humiliation into a powerful testament to truth and resilience. Her journey reminds us that kindness can triumph over cruelty, inspiring us to honor those who shape us and stand up against injustice. Share your thoughts in the comments. How did Loretta and Zora's story touch you? Where are you listening from, and what lessons will you carry forward? Thank you for joining me in this heartfelt tale. Don't forget to subscribe and like to catch more stories that move the soul. We'll see you in the next one.